Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our next to last concert. I cannot believe I'm saying that. It feels like we just got started in September, but here we are in April. I'm thrilled to have all of you here for the pre-concert talk. It's a very unusual program we have for you. I'm delighted to welcome my dear friend and old colleague, Meyn. Please give him a big hand.
Thanks, Gary.
It's always such a pleasure for me to work with him because this is a living composer. So anytime we present composers, you can ask him all kinds of questions. He knows how this process works.
I'm not dead yet, yeah.
No, we want to keep you living as long as possible. So people always say, well, what is solo chamber music? It sounds like it's in conflict with itself. The whole idea of chamber music is multiple instruments sounding like one whole. And certainly that has elements of it here, but one of the reasons we called it solo chamber music is because every one of the pieces has enormous solos that really would be very welcome in a concerto or even in a work that is solo without any other accompanying instruments. So it's a very exciting program for us. We'll start with Mrs. Beach. You'll see in your programs, our order is actually correct in your programs. We're starting with the Kodaly, but this talk is going to start with Mrs. Beach because she's quite unusual. If you look at your program notes from Laurie Shulman, Mrs. Beach was actually named, she was supposed to, at all the concerts, be called Mrs. Beach rather than Amy Beach because her husband, besides the fact that he kind of, let's say by 21st century was very heavy-handed, let's put it that way. He not only insisted that she would have his initials at every program and would speak to her, people would speak to her as Mrs. Beach, but also he pretty much forbade her from being the virtuoso pianist that she was. She made her debut as a pianist at the age of like 9. Her music was played in Carnegie Hall before she was 16 years old. So she was really quite a special individual, and I think that you'll hear that her music is actually quite special. Now, one thing we should talk about is when you're writing in the time that this was written, which is 1944, maybe you might speak a little bit about what was going on musically in the world. We know about Stravinsky and we know about Bartók, but this is pretty much going to be the opposite of that, isn't it?
Oh, this is incredible. I mean, so 1938 is when this piece is written. This is the end, or toward the end of her compositional career. And we'll find this, I think, also a bit with Korngold's music, that at this period, you know, we've, as you mentioned, some of the great modern composers. There's Bartók and Schoenberg. You said Schoenberg, I think.
Stravinsky.
And Stravinsky,
yeah,
of course.
Yeah.
But this is going to be more of the sort of late romanticism that we would get, I think, like as an extension of Brahms and Strauss and that sort of thing.
Indeed, and one of the things that's really unique about this piece, and one of the reasons I really love it, is it sort of straddles this unusual marriage between the late German Romanticism, as Till just mentioned, and also Impressionism. And we think about, like, why would you want to marry the two? And yet, in this piece, I think you'll agree, it really marries it beautifully. Oh, yeah. Now, one of the things that is really interesting about Mrs. Beach is she was a New Englander. And in this piece, you'll hear with some of the examples, there's real New England sense of humor. Now, if you ask what that means, well, let's talk about what it's not. It's not a knee slapper, right? It's not too many dirty jokes. It's rather highfalutin and maybe a smile here and there.
Yeah, like pretty well contained.
Quite, yeah. Well, there's a lot of England in New England. So I think that a lot of this had to do with her background. Her background was quite exciting, actually. When Till and I were preparing this, we were thinking about, well, especially when she was younger in the beginning of the 20th century, what did one do when they didn't work? Well, they studied music, right? It was what we would call the classical Greek education. So they might say, well, let's read some Plato on one afternoon. Let's read something about astronomy. Let's learn something about the sciences. I mean, today it sounds very quaint, doesn't it?
Well, it does today. Plus, I mean, where's the time? But if you have all of this time, you educate yourself or you become educated. And I looked back over what the quadrivium was, the ancient quadrivium, and it's the mathematical arts, and it includes music.
Indeed. And so, look, for example, many musicians, starting with probably with Bach, the great numerologist, were very comfortable with this, and yet in our time, that seems like a strange hobby, if nothing. But I would say that Mrs. Beach, before she became Mrs. Beach, by the way, she was married very young.
Yeah, oh, yeah.
Certainly was surrounded by all these sciences, and it was really interesting. So our first track is really interesting because the opening of it is without any question impressionistic. It's a lot of piano cascading chords, and then the entrance of the solo instrument is what kind of belies the title of this concert, Solo Chamber Music. Let's hear number 1, please.
So I was going to say this is richly tonal music, as you can hear. This kind of music was popular, one could say, 40 years before this, and yet there are composers like Amy Beach who are doing this.
Yeah, and the interesting thing, the harmonic structure of this, we'd like to talk about something called the whole tone scale, which most musicians will identify with Impressionism. So perhaps you would demonstrate?
Sure. So actually something that we heard in the violin was, besides all of this romantic tonality, there's actually a very ambiguous type of scale that we heard in the violin. And the top of the scale was octotonic, which is pretty dissonant, and that would be like this. And the bottom of the scale was whole tone, so I start the scale octotonic. So at the bottom, we have more of the French kind of open.
Yes. So many whole tones, not too many semitones.
Right, right.
That way it just seems like it's all open and very beautiful.
Yeah.
Now, our second one is also from movement number 1 on the second track, and it is incredibly sort of rich, late romantic, high point writing. I think we mentioned something about the New England sense of humor, and I don't want to knock it because we love our New Englanders. We have many in our audience. But this is probably in Mrs. Beach's time quite unusual. You know, she's already lived through Brahms and she's lived through Schubert, through all of this. Well, Schubert she didn't live through, but the point is that the late Romanticism, she's kind of looking back on it as opposed to looking forward to the Second Viennese School and maybe atonality, things like that.
And in fact, one thing we might not have mentioned is that she was born in 1867, so that's pretty early, and that's kind of like already the late Romantic period. But then she dies in 1944. This piece she wrote when she was 71 years old, so it was well into the 20th century.
She knew what she was doing. Let's hear number 2, please. So you can see this is very Brahmsian. It's got blocked chords and everything else. Interesting about her birth date and death date, there's a lot of Strauss writing here. I mean, she quotes Strauss all the time. And Strauss is someone, when we went to music school, everybody said, well, obviously 19th century composer. Died in 49, if memory serves. Right. Lived almost half the 20th century. Yeah. So even though we think of him as, in fact, the 4 last songs,
I was just going to say my
super
favorites.
Romantic, right? And then 49, he writes stuff like
that.
This. So number 3 will be more in movement number 2, which is actually very interesting. It's an ABA form where it has a scherzo in the middle, which we'll talk about in a moment. Mm-hmm. But the opening is very Brahmsian. It's very rich. And it actually has sort of a stress between the cello and the violin in that you're trying to move up in the scale and she kind of keeps you down in the lower positions. Really, really effective writing. Can we hear number 3, please?
And there's some chromaticism at the top. And when we say chromaticism, we mostly mean half steps. that are kind of, in this case, they were falling from the top, going down in half steps.
Yeah, so even with the structure of Brahmsian Romanticism, you have that little bit of hint of Impressionism. Now, the next one is, as I promised you, the little scherzo. Now, Mark Presto. Presto is usually a very quick tempo. But the way she writes this is quite interesting because it's a more charming presto. At this series, how many times have we talked about Brahms' scherzi, which, supposedly that meant joke, except for Brahms, they're all tragic. And they're all dark. But in this case, this is actually not a virtuosic presto. This is more of a cute presto. So let's have number 4, please.
One of the techniques she's using there compositionally is to fragment the melody and create these little motives that she then kind of tosses around between the instruments in a cascading way.
Yeah, absolutely. And now we'll talk about the last movement, which is really interesting because it starts out dense. The whole piece actually starts out dense, but then it becomes actually more transparent as we get into this next track. I find the last movement actually the most American. It's something that you might even identify with Copland or even Bernstein. I mean, it's one of those things where it's absolute positivity all the time.
I think it has something to do with the rhythm, that has that and its major quality, but we'll hear toward the end of this clip that it's going to have a sort of lightly jazzy flavor to it.
For sure. Number 5, please.
Still has that French quality to it, though.
For sure, yeah. Well, you remember that Copland studied with Nathalie Boulanger in Paris, so there's no way you're going to get the French out of the New Englanders. So, our next composer is Zoltán Kodály. There he is, with a really nice goatee. I love that picture. He is probably, along with Bartók, the most Hungarian folk composer, but I think we need to explain folk music a little bit. I think it sometimes has a pejorative quality. In other words, if you're a professional composer, but you write folk music, and Sibelius had a problem with that, somehow you were less serious than if you had studied the conservatory from day one, and you had made sure that you could do all the exercises and write fugues and so on and so forth. Kodály played all of the instruments, and I think that once you go to Hungary, or those of you who have been, it's pretty impossible to avoid all instruments. There's like in Prague and Budapest, there's no way you're not going to hear folk music everywhere in the most sophisticated places and in pubs and anywhere else. So this is music that really takes advantage of the folk character and takes advantage of the cello and the violin.
Well, and I won't do this, but I could talk forever about the use of folk music at this period because we've already had Liszt and Brahms and Dvorak and the way they use folk music. Then when Bartók and Kodály come along a generation later, they say the way that those composers were doing it was not authentic. Here's the real way to do it. They go out into the field, they do field recordings, thousands of them, then they transcribe them, and then they use them in their own music.
Yes, and I love it when we talk about the authenticity of real music. I mean, in the end, all of us who hear music, it's all authentic, you know?
Right.
So I think that the thing that's really amazing about this is the language of Kodály. And we should really talk about the Dorian scale. Maybe you could touch upon that.
Yeah, so something that gives a flavor of folk music is often these modal scales that, once again, there's a long history, but they're kind of like the Greek modes in a way, but they've been used in folk music. So Kodály will use the Dorian scale. I believe it's in the next track, and the Dorian scale sounds like this. So it's like a minor scale, but when you get to the top, there's a little bit of lightness to it because there's one note that's been raised.
So once again, it's mostly whole tones.
A lot of whole tones in there, yeah.
So let's listen to number 6, and then we can talk about this incredibly beautiful cello melody. Number 6, please. Yeah, so this is the cello. Basically, is more of the human male voice, and that's really the range of it. And it starts pretty much at the top and goes to the very low end of that, which gives us a real vocal quality. And one of the great things about this duo, you have two instruments on stage, but he has a way of making you believe that it's a whole string ensemble. It's really quite rich.
Yeah, actually, I don't want to make you feel bad, but your instrument only goes down to G.
I know. That's what I'm saying. The cello gets to go all the way
down to the C.
They have the extra string, but of course we have the E string, so it's a trade-off.
That's true.
So the next one is much more belie, I would say, of where we are in the 20th century. There's dissonance in this example, and it's improvisatory. So there's a lot of embellishments and things that are around the main notes. Let's listen to number 7, please.
So this music is actually, believe it or not, it's still tonal, even though it sounds very dissonant. But the way that Kodaly is making us feel that dissonance is writing in basically bitonally. He has one instrument playing one dissonant scale, the other instrument playing a different one, and they're clashing.
Yeah, it's really interesting because if you just break them down, as you said, they're very tonal. Yeah. But the experience here is that this is both instruments fighting each other. Mm-hmm. Now, what's interesting about our next example is that second slow movement is really a conversation. This is pretty much the opposite of what you just heard. In this, you're going to hear cadential, if you will, conversation between both instruments, and they accompany each other, I would say, for no more than 40% of the time. Most of it is single instrument playing, or the other instrument is commenting with a pizzicato or two, something like that. So let's listen to the slow movement. Number 9, please.
I think, is this one 8? It's 8.
Yeah, sorry, number 8.
Two things I love about this part of the piece is that he's treating these instruments equally, but he's allowing them to trade off what kind of material they have. So when the violin is playing multiple stops and chords, the cello kind of floats up above it.
Yeah, and vice versa in this example.
And vice versa. Yeah. And then the urgency of it really comes from the chromatic movement. That is, it's moving by half steps higher and higher.
Now, number 9 will be the beginning of the finale, and it's really interesting because even starting with Haydn, he was a big fan of starting slowly, warming up into something. In this case, it's pretty much the exact opposite. It is slow, but it's impassioned, speaking, declamatory, sort of an introduction. The pizzicato cello material is really percussive, and so in many ways, you're going to hear all of the instruments that are not the string instruments, like cimbalom.
And you're going to get, in this passage, you're the one playing this really urgent violin line. And to keep it family friendly, I'd say it's like fervent.
Yeah, very family friendly. Let's have number 9, please. I feel like you could almost put words to this. These cadenzas, they all almost say one to the, leave me out of this, or I don't want to talk to you, or maybe, no, you should be talking. It really could be a script, and he uses his folk melodies in such an incredible way. We want to demonstrate one last scale in this conversation, and we should talk about the pentatonic scale.
Yeah, so in this next clip, we're going to hear some of the pentatonic scale. I'll put my microphone down for this. But you're going to hear, so penta meaning 5, of course. It's another one of those modal types of scales. You want to hold that for me? Yeah, of course. And he actually does this. So it's like it's missing some notes, but on purpose.
Yeah, and it sounds almost like those 60s sci-fi shows. So we really love that. Let's hear number 10, please. So you can see this is what Till was referring to in terms of range. You have the cello really taking advantage of the bass register, and then the soprano register is a violin. Very virtuosic piece, about 25, 30 minutes long, and it's sort of, so for us, it's sort of a marathon, but I think that you'll find it goes by really fast because it's got a lot of really great material. Okay, our final piece after the intermission is going to go with Eric Wolfgang Korngold. So let's take a look at this slide, because I think all of you who love old films will recognize Robin Hood over there and King's Row. Korngold was, I'm pretty sure, if it wasn't for World War II, would not be the voice of the golden age of Hollywood. He came essentially because of the unrest in Europe, and because, of course, he wanted to compose the kind of music that his teacher Mahler would have composed, and that was no longer going to be the case when in the 40s. So this is a very young piece. This is a very piece. In fact, I think I can think of essentially 2 other composers who at age 16 put together a quintet like this. I don't mean a quintet like this, but the quality of the music of this quintet, and that would be Mendelssohn and Mozart. I mean, there's really no one who would be able to do, even to encompass the kind of thing in their imagination, let alone write it. And to make matters worse for our pianists, Korngold, did premiere this piece as a pianist. So it's not like you could just write it on paper and then say, well, that's your problem.
Right. No, he actually knew what he was doing, but he made it hard on purpose.
Yeah, he went out and played it.
When he was 14 years old, and he was, Mahler had heard him at this point, and Mahler said he was a musical genius. So, from that moment on, he had wonderful teachers. Zemlinsky was one of his teachers. Yes. And then when he emigrated to the United States in the mid-30s, he was actually going back and forth between Austria and the US because the film companies kept saying, come back from your concertizing and please write another film score. Yeah. And then he stayed.
And not only that, he had incredible relationships with soloists, probably the most famous, Jascha Heifetz, who commissioned the great Korngold Violin Concerto. And there are a lot of anecdotes I can tell you about that, just we won't have time today. So let's listen to the opening of this. As I mentioned, the voice of the golden age of Hollywood, it's pretty much evident here from the first note, from the opening chords of the piano. Let's listen to number 1, please. It's interesting to me. I was looking at Mrs. Beach and now looking at Korngold. They just look like average folks, don't you think? But then they write this incredible music. So it just goes to show you, it's not necessarily the way you look that you sound like that.
Yeah, so just be careful. The people you meet on the street, they might be one of these guys.
Might be amazing geniuses. So the second theme is an F major. It's a distant key to the E major, which is a really open major key. It's 4 sharps. And it's one of those things where when you're in a distant key, and especially with the rhythms here, everything is tied over. Perhaps maybe you could talk about elisions and ties and things like what does that mean to the rhythm of the group when everything is a beat off or tied to a next beat?
Yeah, see, that always reminds me of Brahms and to a certain degree Strauss as well. Yeah, I mean that and then the key change that you're mentioning. When we listen to Beethoven, we listen to Mozart and Haydn, there are certain expectations that our ears have. The next theme will be in this key. And Korngold, like so many late Romantic composers, breaks those rules, but does it for the reason of beauty. So to go from E major with 4 sharps and F major to 1 flat is pretty dramatic.
Yeah, so I think that the reason he does it, and you'll see this, is there's constant motion in this music, except for the second movement we'll get to. It is the kind of music, even when it's slow, it constantly moves. It doesn't sit there and block eyes. Let's listen to the next example, please.
So such beautiful, passionate late romanticism.
And the 3 against 2, then the piano, the triplets against the duple rhythm in the melody.
Yeah.
The adagio, the second movement, is really, really interesting. This is what we're talking about here. When you have the main theme that is coupled with all of the accompaniments with it, it could be very, very noisy. But the genius of Korngold is you hear everything. And the only one actually I can think of where you can have thick melodies and still hear everything is Boulez's music. We'll get to it another time.
Oh, boy.
But the main thing here is you have octaves with cello and viola and contrapuntal melody. So let's hear number 13, please.
There's something about the construction of that theme that, you'll hear this in the performance. It's just really makes your heart just beat so strongly, at least it does mine.
For sure. This movement is actually, in many ways, very difficult because he writes it that it's basically on the verge of just almost grinding to a halt. And the whole magic is that you hold the audience's attention without going too fast and also not letting it stop. It's a tough thing for the performers.
Well, I mean, this is not Mahler's Adagietto, but it has some of that quality. And I was going to mention that it's cast in an 8/8 time signature. Many composers today would say, why 8/8? Put it in 4/4. But he actually wants those eighth notes to be each one of them felt and drawn out.
The pulse is the eighth note. And actually, that's a really interesting conversation because just looking at the score, I wish I had a slide of the score, it looks actually a lot faster than it sounds. And that's a whole other thing that when we rehearse things, you have to make it sound the way the composer wanted it rather than the way it looks on paper.
But I have to say one more thing about not just this excerpt, but the whole piece. It really tickles me that when you look at the score, you see all of these German words in there. It's the same way that Mahler would do it, only actually Mahler times 2.
Every bar practically.
And it's the things like he says, nicht schleppend, which you see in Mahler. What, of course, that means...
Don't drag.
Don't schlep. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, if you studied with Mahler, I think one more year, Mahler would have said, kids, stop with telling what to do, what not to do. The next track is the last variation. It's got more scales in it. It's slightly faster, but again, it's one of those things where you capture the audience's imagination in slow, beautiful melody, and then you begin to release. So there's a sense of tension release. Next one, please.
And so that was variation 8 out of 9 variations. And
not yet.
Yes, very, very imposing there. Yeah. And what he's doing is, as you would expect from theme and variations, he takes the theme and puts it into different contexts. And in that one, he just hid the little motive in there, da-da-dum, just kind of sneaks it in.
Yeah, and there's so much Disney in this, you'll hear. It's amazing. All right, the last 2 examples are from the finale. And this is where, again, he goes back to, I think, what we think of as bread and butter, and that is the film writing. Now, so this slide, of course, Die Deutsche Stadt is an opera, but I think the way he finishes this quintet obviously predates the opera. And we listen to what will become his signature. So let's hear the finale here, and I don't think in this example you're going to hear this big cadenza for the violin, but you certainly will this afternoon. Number 15, please.
And here again, so yet another dissonant one. So this is actually different from some of the beautiful consonances we've heard, and he gets that from the scale he's using, which is octatonic.
And also it has what we identify with like the horror film soundtrack, you know, because it sounds like really, really scary, and the unison strings or something, you know, I always think of like, this is the dark room you never want to go into.
But you know what's interesting, and we may not have said this, but this piece is from 1921. This predates any of his film music by more than 10 years. So, you know, at this point, there was no film music. That wasn't happening yet. And now, you know, we can listen to this composer's great Austro-Hungarian composer who is not a film composer yet, but we can hear that he will be.
Yeah, because I think you would agree that you test out material long before you put it together in your new music. The last track is a Giacoso finale. It's very Straussian. I think that this is where it's charm, and yet it's quite thick, and there's a very powerful fugue here. Let's listen to number 16.
That sounds hard, Gary.
Well, so the story goes, I mentioned the Korngold Violin Concerto, the story that Mr. Heifetz, apparently, when he commissioned the concerto, he loved the first two movements, and Korngold was very much on time. He was very Austrian, never late, you know, delivers everything. And finally, the last movement gets delivered, and Heifetz calls Korngold up 5 minutes after he looks at it, and he says, "Eric, this passage is unplayable." At which point, without missing a beat, Korngold said, "You're Heifetz, aren't you?" and hung up.
So can I use that line sometime?
You should, absolutely, yeah. Any violinist you want. So basically, yeah, this is very virtuosic writing for all of the instruments. It's very thick, it's very complicated, but I think the genius of this young Korngold is that together, it really, really works, and this is why solo chamber music is one of my favorite ways to play chamber music, and I hope you enjoy this concert. Thank you so much for being here, and we'll see you in a few minutes.
Thank you.